Could I rank all 23 Laurel and Hardy feature comedies? I certainly could. What's your favorite Laurel and Hardy feature film? Please comment below. I figure we'll take a few videos to work our way through every single one, talking about what I like and dislike about each, and you can see if your ranking matches up with mine. Now keep in mind, we're only doing starring feature film vehicles, so no silent or sound short subjects, and also no feature films like Hollywood Party or The Hollywood Review, where Laurel and Hardy play supporting roles. We're going to focus solely on Stan and Ollie in their own starring glory. From 1931 to 1951, let's see what some of the best and worst of the feature films Stan and Ollie made have to offer. I'm glad you're joining me. Come on! Here on Betamax Blocker, we always try to support the underdog. I have videos defending things like Summer in Paradise, Buddy Buddy, the Marx Brothers Love Happy. We always try to look for the positives in these things that other people are so quick to disparage. But sadly, the bottom of my Laurel and Hardy ranking has to be the one that everyone else would probably put at the bottom too, Utopia, also known as A Tall K or Robinson Crusoe Land, or about 500 other titles in various countries. The production of Utopia was a mess. Stan and Ollie traveling to Europe to film with a director who could barely speak English and an international cast, and one mishap after the other, just built and built. Both of them were very sick at the time, even though they were in their late 50s, early 60s when they filmed this. They both look like they're about 80 years old. It just seems like it was a terrible experience all around. And ultimately it leads to a film that, while it does have a few shining moments, is overall pretty weak. Now first of all, we have to talk about Stan and Ollie's performance. They did all their lines in English and other actors were dubbed into whatever language was necessary. And Stan and Ollie do have some good moments in this, notably when Ollie shows Stan the life raft and explains it inflates to hold 4 people, to which Stanley replies, "Well, what about me?" after looking at Ollie. And that works pretty well. And they're both trying really hard, even though they look so tired and haggard. And there is a decent supporting performance by a couple of the co-stars, notably Susie Delaire, who passed away just a couple years ago. She was well over 100, I believe. But at the end of the day, the dubbing really takes away from the story, not to mention the editing. Now I have to preface this by saying the only copy of Utopia I have is a cheapo American public domain copy that I got in this public domain set probably 20 years ago. And don't be expecting anything particularly high quality from a public domain release like this. So this print of Utopia is not restored or spruced up in any way. And someday maybe I'll order a nicer DVD version from France or England. But even I think in a restored form, I'm not sure Utopia would really work all that well, just because there's so many different backgrounds and nationalities involved. It seems like it was never really a cohesive project. Indeed, there's a whole book written on the difficulties about the filming and the production of it, and it seemed like a nightmare for everybody involved. Last week, when we talked about Frank Capra, I mentioned Lost Horizon, probably my second favorite Capra film after Arsenic and Old Lace. And Lost Horizon deals with the concept of a utopian society on Earth, and how no one's ever going to be truly satisfied with a utopia. There's no such thing as a perfect world or a perfect society. And Utopia does kind of roll with that idea. Stan and Ollie, after receiving an inheritance, get this kind of rundown yacht and discover an atoll where they decide to make their own country, their own society, that sort of thing. And the rules will be no laws, no immigration policies, no taxes, a complete freedom, a paradise for everybody, and naturally other people roll in very quickly, especially after the discovery of uranium, and overrun the place, and Stan and Ollie have no right to stand there and enforce their rules because it's complete anarchy. Utopia is an entirely free society. And this is an interesting premise, and you can do a lot with this, but the problem is the politics, this idea of a society with no laws or anything else, is never really used to create jokes. Instead, it's just kind of preached about. We talked about things like Duck Soup, which topped my Marx Brothers ranking. Duck Soup is aged like fine wine. Those jokes are as relevant and as pointed today as they were back in 1933. But Utopia tries to use sort of slapstick gags, which are fine. You know, Stanley dropping all the engine parts into the ocean is pretty amusing, but they don't use the concept of the utopian society for the bulk of the humor. And that suffers too, because we go from simple slapstick jokes to characters with political ideologies explaining all this stuff. It's very uneven and not a great watch. Now again, someday I hope to find a restored print. There are fan restorations as well, some of which, such as the one from Hats Off Entertainment, use Hal Roach-era music reinserted into the film. But at the end of the day, Utopia was pretty disappointing. I hadn't watched it in a very long time. I didn't really find much to latch onto or to enjoy. I wish they'd had a better chance to go out with a high note with a really amazing comedy instead of this confused, befuddled sort of international mess. Coming up next on our list, and faring only slightly better than Utopia, 1944's Nothing But Trouble, not to be confused with the Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd movie of the same name. Now, like Utopia, and like really all of their World War II era films, Nothing But Trouble is indeed influenced by politics, but here it plays out a little bit differently. Nothing But Trouble tells the story of young King Christopher of Orlandia, who is deposed from his native nation due to the war, and has taken refuge and exile in the United States along with his cabinet, and Stan and Ollie befriend him, as young King Christopher doesn't really want to be a head of state, but rather wants to be like American kids, roughhousing and playing football and being silly, and is tired of getting wrapped up in all this stuff. But little does he know, his uncle, Prince Saul, who acts as regent, plans to have him murdered, as Prince Saul realizes that pretty soon his nephew will reach the age of majority and be able to take the throne for himself. He wants to make sure that that doesn't happen, and Prince Saul can maintain all of the power he's already accrued as regent. It's a pretty solid premise for a film. Unfortunately, it isn't quite fully realized here. Nothing But Trouble feels a lot like a Laurel and Hardy movie on autopilot. It's more amusing than funny. There are some decent gags, but none of them are ones that are going to give you belly laughs or anything like that. And it is, of course, heavily influenced by World War II. There's jokes about rationing and labor shortages. Some of these used a greater effect. For example, in a flashback scene, Stan and Ollie go to the employment office in 1932, which is crowded because everybody's looking for work and nobody's hiring. They go back in 1944, and the employment office is still crowded, but this time everybody is looking for employees because the men have all been drafted into service and the women have all been forced to take their jobs. So it's the opposite situation, but Stan and Ollie experience the same result, that sort of thing. Pretty clever stuff. The highlight of this movie for me has got to be Philip Merivale as the evil Prince Saul, playing very much like Boris Karloff. He's debonair, he's super friendly to his young nephew who he plans to kill, and he's a complete creep, that sort of thing. Walking around in white tie and tails, plotting everybody else's death. We talked a little bit about Philip Merivale in one of my least favorite Hitchcock films, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, where he plays Gene Raymond's Southern gentleman father. And yeah, wasn't too impressed with that. But here he does a much better job, and he's the main reason to watch the film. I also like that we see both Mary Boland and Henry O'Neill. Henry O'Neill was in Air Raid Wardens as well, and sadly wasn't given much to do, but he's very funny here. Boland and O'Neill playing a married couple who are social climbers, a very common idea in 1940s comedies, people using the war and royalty being forced into exile in the US as a chance to kind of boost their own social status. That's used to great effect. They hire Stan and Ollie as cook and butler and just about die from the awful food that Oliver makes, that sort of thing. There's some jokes about mock turtle soup and that kind of thing. So a decent supporting cast, which is sadly let down by David Leland as young King Christopher. And his performance, there's debate as if he's dubbed, or if he just has a weird puberty voice, or maybe dubbed by somebody with a weird puberty voice, who knows. But his performance is really dull. He doesn't have great chemistry with Stan and Ollie, and we're supposed to be rooting for this preteen, early teen boy king to sort of take over the film and be a hero, and it never really happens. It wouldn't surprise me if Nothing But Trouble was met with some editing and some reshooting around this time. It proved to be a big hit for the studio and for Stan and Ollie, one of their most commercially successful films, but at the end of the day, it didn't quite live up to that expectation. It has some decent gags, especially involving stealing food from a lion and trying to serve it to people, and, you know, a little bit of Harold Lloyd-esque, you know, escapades on a skyscraper near the end of the film. But at the end of the day, Nothing But Trouble is really pretty skippable. It had a lot more potential than what we actually got to see. Moving up a peg from our previous two, 1943's The Dancing Masters comes next. There are elements of The Dancing Masters that are still firmly rooted in World War II. Notably, Laurel and Hardy are friends with a young inventor who is desperate to make good by making a very successful ray gun machine that the army can use. But this kind of takes a back seat to most of the other wacky slapstick hijinks that take place, and honestly I think the movie's kind of better for that. The Dancing Masters had something of a troubled production, as outlined in the booklet for the film, originally intended as a longer, more elaborate piece, and then being whittled down to just a quick hour-long comedy film with some of the elements still there, but not all of them. And indeed, I can't help but think The Dancing Masters feels like it's a series of extended gags, rather than a complete, fully fleshed out feature film. And it definitely stops and starts quite a bit and has some pacing issues. Some of the gags actually work quite well. Notably, at the beginning of the film, there's an extended routine where gangsters attempt to sell Laurel and Hardy a fake insurance policy. The local mob, under scrutiny from the police department, replaces their protection racket with a phony insurance racket. And a young Robert Mitchum, along with frequent comic-heavy George Lloyd, you can see him in the photo there, pay a visit to Stan and Ollie in an attempt to sell them one of those fake insurance policies. It's a very funny scene, and Robert Mitchum, long before we've seen him in other films we've talked about on this channel, Robert Mitchum shows up and bounces off Stan and Ollie really pretty well in a very funny scene. You need an insurance policy. We do not. Yes, you do. And it's a very funny bit. I kind of wish they'd given him more to do. But anyway, that is quickly swept aside in favor of reenactments of gags from several of their earlier films, notably the silent film Battle of the Century, where they redo the Ollie needs to have Stan get hurt to collect money bit. That's copied pretty close to the original there, as well as the last Laurel and Hardy short subject, Thicker Than Water. The grandfather clock auction scene is copied to, I think, a much less effective facsimile than before. There are also some extended gags that are original but don't really work too well. The finale involves Laurel and Hardy on an out-of-control bus that crashes into an amusement park and ends up on the roller coaster tracks, and while that might sound fun when I say it, it's pretty contrived and dull to watch. And there are extended bits of the duo dancing. Some of those gags work and others don't. And of course, when the occasional World War II ray gun angle pops back into the story, we get a scene that's actually relatively funny of a demonstration of the weapon with Stanley as Professor Fin-Gorp, who ruins the experiment, ruins the demonstration, of course, when Ollie says, "Why didn't you tell us?" "Well, I don't speak any English," that sort of thing. So there's a couple good gags to be had, but all in all, it feels kind of choppy, kind of disconcerted. Indeed, this booklet says that the original script would have fleshed out these ideas and connected them better, but we're left with kind of a fun little highlight reel. But that being said, Laurel and Hardy are on pretty good form in this. They do their best with the gags that they're given. Their scenes are always a highlight to watch. They get to play opposite Margaret Dumont of Marx Brothers fame, albeit they don't do much with her. I kind of wish they'd had extended scenes where they could have acted opposite her and done some wacky wordplay. Sadly, that's not really a thing here. I like that she's in it. And at the end of the day, it's a short, fun, kind of innocuous comedy. Not great, as it ranks so low on my list, but not terrible either. Definitely worth a watch. So make sure you put your favorite Laurel and Hardy comedies below, and come back here in a couple weeks and we'll see a few more on my Laurel and Hardy ranking. Till then, my friends, so long for now.